Thank you for inviting me for this presentation, Exploring Alternative Education Resources Ontario and the services that we provide. As Jill mentioned, my name is Isabel Trueman, and I have 8 years experience at AERO, and my regular work does include transcriptions as well as troubleshooting the AERO website. Today, I'm going to do an overview of what services AERO provides, who can access those services, what to expect when you get alternate format materials from AERO, and some of the as a high-level overview of what we provide. So just to begin, a little bit of Zoom orientation. Please, if you have any questions during the presentation, place them in the chat. There will be time for questions at the end as well. If you are watching the recording and you have questions about AERO services, please email us at aero@alternativeresources.ca. It's the best way to get in touch with us. Within Zoom, during questions, you can open the participants window and raise your hand. We'll also be using the polling feature tonight. And if I could have Jill just start the first test poll, just to give everyone a feel.
Is that showing up now?
I believe it is.
Yes.
It might actually be showing all 3 questions at once.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know how to control that. It usually just shows up one at a time. Anyways, if people could just answer the first one.
Yeah, if you can just answer the first one, we'll go with it. Just how was the weather today? This will come up. There are 3 questions, one now, one in the middle, one at the end.
I'm sorry, Isabel, it seems that they're all showing at once. So let's just go with that. We'll have to focus on the first one now, and that's too bad. I'm not sure why this is happening. Anyways, we have about half of our people have voted. We'll leave it open for a little bit longer since they're answering 3 questions.
Yes, do you happen to know if we run the poll again later on, if it will be able to answer responses again?
To be honest, no. We'll have to see what happens. Maybe I will take, you know what, I'll take a couple of screenshots and then I can refer back to them if we lose this. Usually they come up one at a time.
Yeah, troubleshooting for another day.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll just take it. Sorry about this. And we'll definitely try and bring this up again, and maybe it will.
I might just do it again at the end instead of doing it in the middle as well.
Yeah, we'll see if this if that works. Okay, so let's just we'll end that for now.
All right.
So I can share the results. There's the weather and the other thing.
Oh. Well, in good news, if you're in my area of the province, it is supposed to be nice and sunny tomorrow. And I see that many people are familiar with PDF and Word, and many of the other formats that we have, people are less familiar with them. Oh, and I love all of your optimism that everyone who answered question 3, will you share something you learned today with someone who will use it? Without even hearing
yes.
what you had to say, you've already said absolutely. I love that enthusiasm today.
All right, I'll stop that for now.
Right. And as Jill mentioned, a webinar recording will be posted to the IDA Ontario YouTube channel, and there'll be a link to that from the previous webinar section of the IDA website. So, introducing AERO. AERO is an alternate format resource repository that supplies alternate format educational materials to students in Ontario. I have a picture of W. Ross Macdonald School here. It's located in Brantford, and AERO is located in the basement of the school. AERO is part of the Provincial and Demonstration School branch of the Ministry of Education. But we also work with the Ministry of Colleges and Universities to provide materials to post-secondary students. So, our service. The slide is a bit wordy, but the words have been selected with care. AERO is a demand-based alternate format repository. We don't like the term library. We provide alternate format materials to students with perceptual disabilities across Ontario from junior kindergarten to postdoctorate studies for educational purposes. We offer a free transcription service to publicly funded institutions. So the definition of perceptual disability, I'll get to a bit later on, but we are a service that provides materials to educational purposes. So it has to be related to a course that a student is taking. AERO provides accessible material to a student when the original format is in a format they cannot use due to the perceptual disability they have. And the material AERO provides replaces a print or other purchase copy that is available to the student, but in a format they can't use. That's one of the reasons we don't like the term library. When you go to a library, you're borrowing the materials that the library has, but there's no expectation that you have already purchased a copy of that material. Some of the other key differences with AERO is that we're a demand-based service. We don't curate our collection to try and predict what books will be required by students, what novels will be of interest to students in the province. We have partners in this work. So the Canadian Association of Educational Resource Centres for Alternate Format Materials, or CARE, reflects all provinces of Canada. And there's different centres like AERO doing the same work. They're publicly funded centres which coordinate the provision of alternate format educational materials for students with print disabilities. All of us work together to share materials with each other. We create our materials to certain standards so that we know what we're getting when we borrow materials from another resource center. And we lend materials without charge to other CARE members. If you want to know more about CARE, please visit the CARE website, which has contact information for all of the centers across Canada. We also partner with publishers. So our partnership with publishers means that we will request files from them, which will then get added to our repository. Publishers can most often provide us with files, but in some cases, if it's from a branch of the publisher which is in another country, or if it's a title which is out of print, they may not be able to provide files. Sometimes the files we get from the publishers are ready to use right away. Other times, it requires more work on our part to take those files and meet the students' needs. We partner with publishers and the Ontario Library Association for the Forest of Reading program. The program launches every October, and there's a lot of background work to try and make sure that AERO has PDFs of the titles which are going to be part of that program, so that when alternate formats are requested, we are ready to produce materials in the formats that students require. And if you want to know more about which publishers we partner with, please go to our website. That's where the most up-to-date list is. And if you are a publisher who has seen this, please get in touch. We'd love to partner with you. So, who can receive AERO services? We service students from junior kindergarten to postdoctorate studies. We service Ontarians, and our services are provided through the institution the student attends. We service students with perceptual disabilities. Now, perceptual disability, the term has come up a few times, and it's the one that's used in the Copyright Act. The Copyright Act has a section to it which says that if a student needs book material from a publisher, but it's not in a format that they can use, and they need it for a course for educational purposes, that institutions or resource centers can take that material and they can produce it in a format that the student is able to use. And so the legal definition of perceptual disability comes from the Copyright Act, Section 32. And for the purposes of this agreement, a perceptual disability includes one or more of the following range of difficulties. There are three main categories. First, for educational purposes, a student whose visual acuity is not sufficient for the student to participate in everyday educational activities without the accommodation of instructional and related materials in multiple formats. In short, the student cannot see the book. Or an inability to hold and manipulate printed materials. The student can't turn the page. The student can't hold the book. The student can't carry all the books with them. And thirdly, any other impairment, including but not limited to dyslexia and brain injury, such that the student cannot use print publications other than in formats not available from the publisher. In other words, the eyes are seeing the material correctly, but the way the brain is interpreting the material means that the student can't use that print material in the same way as other students. Or in some cases of brain injury, such as post-concussion syndrome, a student might get eye fatigue and they can't use that material for as long. So conditions like post-concussion syndrome and dyslexia and many other conditions also qualify as perceptual disabilities. So there are some differences in our services for Ontario public educational institutions and the private and federal ones. For Ontario public schools, AERO will loan existing materials. We'll also borrow resources from our partners in other provinces, and we will create new materials. So if we don't have something, we will create it. When I described AERO as a demand-based service, this is where the demand comes from for AERO to add new materials. For private or federal schools in Ontario, we will loan existing materials and we will borrow resources from other provinces. But we will not create any new materials for those schools. Okay, getting materials from AERO. If you've been through that previous section and you say, oh, yes, the students I know of qualify for AERO services, how does the student then get that material? Students receive AERO materials through an advisor. We are not open to the general public. We are not a service that is provided directly to students. We are not a service that is provided to parents. An advisor is a school, college, or university staff member. They are responsible for checking the eligibility of the student, ensuring that they have a perceptual disability, and ensuring there is a purchased copy of the material for the student that the student can't use. The process for being identified to receive materials differs between elementary schools, secondary schools, and post-secondary institutions. We'll start with the process for elementary secondary institutions. First of all, the student need is identified by the school. The advisor then registers the student and requests material. AERO will provide that material. The advisor delivers the material to the student. And when the student is done with that material, the advisor returns materials. This will either be returning physical copies or deleting files for digital materials. Just like a student receives a textbook at the beginning of the year, and then that textbook is returned at the end of the year, AERO's materials are a loan for that same period of time that the student would have the print copy of material. In principle, the print copy of material the student would be using is set aside and not used by another student while the student has AERO's materials. So students with a need identified that are getting AERO materials are likely on their way, or they already have an IEP or other accommodation plan. Materials can be requested from AERO as a trial if you're not sure if they'll actually help the student. Any school staff can register as an advisor. At AERO, we don't care how advisors organize themselves at a school. It needs to be someone who's registering with an email address that is regularly checked, because email is our main method of communication with advisors. And that's very important if you're requesting something that AERO doesn't currently have in its catalog. When you're requesting new material, there will be communication back and forth, asking about timelines when the material is required. There might be communication about we were unable to get files from a publisher. We will need a print copy of material to create the new resource. And all of this requires communication, and it can also take some time. It can take 2 weeks for AERO to produce new materials from the time we have our timelines and the original to produce from. So it's important that communication is checked regularly. It's also important that requests are placed when you know a student will require that material. We will even accept requests in June for materials that are required in September. Also to remember, AERO school staff are not accommodation experts. The identification of the student need happens at the school. We as AERO staff know what our files can do. We know some major troubleshooting difficulties with some software. And if you have a problem with our files, please let us know if they're not acting as you expect. We will investigate and we will improve the files if they don't meet the student's needs. All materials from AERO are provided through an advisor. As I said, no direct access for students or parents. All materials for elementary, secondary need to be returned or deleted when the student is done with those materials. The post-secondary process is very similar, but different in some important ways. First, the student identifies themselves to an accessibility services office. The advisor from that office will then request materials from AERO. AERO provides those materials, and the advisor delivers the materials to the student. Many times at post-secondary, students might not identify themselves right away to an accessibility services office, but it's important because the onus for asking for accommodation and for helping guide what that accommodation should look like is student directed at the post-secondary level. And there might be some paperwork required there as well. But it's the students who ask and identify that they might need some accommodation. The students help identify those accommodations, and the students with instructors identify the materials that they require, such as textbooks. And materials provided at post-secondary, when a student has purchased a copy, can be kept by that student. In terms of what types of texts are considered educational materials, it is material being used for a course, and AERO will produce books. We do not produce tests. We do not produce teacher-created materials. Teacher-created materials should be born accessible when they're created by the teacher. As I've mentioned, AERO is a demand-based service, so we only have items that have been requested. If it's a book that's come out in the last few months, it's likely not in AERO's repository yet. But we do have over 20,000 items. So that's a title format combination. And AERO handles over 25,000 requests a year. Those requests are for formats such as electronic text, audio, large print, Braille. I'm going to quickly change over to our website. If you'd like an idea of what types of materials AERO has, and you're a parent and not an educator, you can go to our website and the home page, and there is a catalog, browse catalog option, where you can search for materials in our catalog. For some texts, such as Macbeth, it's Shakespeare, there are many editions. The editions are important when they're being studied in class. We have many different versions. Other texts we might not have in our repository. But searching our public catalog interface will show you materials that are complete in our catalog. So if we're in the process of creating something, it's not going to be visible. Right. So before I get into exactly what formats AERO has, talking a bit more about what to expect from our PDFs and our words, I want to talk about accessibility in general. Because we hear, is it accessible? It's used often. It's used in some very specific circumstances as well. But because I'm about to talk a bit about some technical aspects, and I'm talking very much from the perspective of the format, whether or not that works for the student you have in mind will depend on the student. And that comes back to accessibility being multifaceted. There's user skills involved. What skills does the individual have? Are they able to use the assistive technology they have? Also, the software accessibility. Is the software innately accessible, or does it need another tool to be accessible? Does it have built-in text-to-speech? And the actual document design. Is that text in an image actually there? Is there alt text on the image? Is a PDF image only, or is there underlying text? Those are the types of things which are document design that I'm about to get into. But these three aspects of accessibility can also, if applied to a physical world, so user skills, our ability to move. If you think of our ability to, say, slide along the floor or walking on our feet. Software accessibility is like the tools some people have. So tools for walking might include, and mobility might include sneakers with a good grip for a toddler, especially for toddlers, or a wheelchair or a cane. And document design is a bit like the environment. If someone's walking on a sidewalk or a beach, or they're walking on ice or a curling rink, each of those environments creates a different need for different tools and different user skills. But if you don't have the user skills, the tools that match the environment that you have, you'll run into accessibility problems. So digitally, those are user skills, the software tools, and the innate software design. So, AERO's alternate formats. We have PDF, which over 80% of you said you're familiar with. AERO's standard PDF production now is to create a PDF where one page in the PDF is one page in the book. The underlying text is checked to make sure that it will read correctly with text-to-speech software, but AERO does not include alternate text descriptions for images, and we do not include headings within the document. Important to note, AERO updates its files as requested. So we have older PDFs on our system, which are image only. We also have older PDFs on our system, which have an automatic recognition, which will sort of work with text-to-speech and then get kind of garbled because it didn't recognize some words correctly. So if your student needs text-to-speech, please place a request for new material and indicate so in the comments. There was a question from when the registrations that asked, what's the best system for text-to-speech? And I'll just mention here that at AERO, we're not experts in that, and it will likely depend on your student as well. Different text-to-speech systems will have the ability to work with different voices, so different synthetic voices, and that will be a driver. And for each language that your student needs to listen to with text-to-speech, that will require a voice for that language as well. But we don't have something to recommend. It's not something that we test extensively. Second, Kurzweil 3000. It's software that's been around for a while. It's proprietary. It has a text-to-speech software within it. It also has some additional literacy tools for creating things like spelling lists and dictionary lookup. AERO will produce Kurzweil, and when we do produce a Kurzweil, just like with the PDF, we will check the underlying text and ensure that the text that is recognized matches the text on the page. Thirdly, CD audio and DAISY. So these are both audio formats. And DAISY stands for Digital Audible Information System. And a DAISY is in a zipped folder, which has a bunch of audio files in it, but it also has navigation ability. So if you use a DAISY file with a DAISY reader, you can navigate quickly to chapter headings and different sections of the book. Depending how the DAISY is formatted, you can navigate directly to the different pages of the book. Both of these formats can be used like in MP3 audio, so just listening to a sound file. For the DAISY, you open up the zipped folder and you listen to the audio files in order. Our default for creating new audio files is to create DAISY, because that additional level of navigation is essential for our users who are visually impaired when they go to listen and navigate audio. And our default is to create synthetic voice audio. But upon request, we will create human voice instead of synthetic voice. For these audio files, if there's a text where there are images that convey important information, most often those images will be described. So if there's a map, it will describe the key, most important elements from that map. Word. Word is a Word document. If you've used Microsoft Word, you know what our words look like. But very specifically, any text that we convert to Word, the original page numbers from the text are kept so that students can navigate to pages. All images are stripped from the Word, and if the images contained pertinent information, the images are described and the description is put into the Word document. So our words are a bit designed more for users who are visually impaired rather than those with learning disabilities. But for some texts like a novel, they will work equally well for students as a PDF will. We also have Braille and large print. So the image you see is a long hallway with archival shelving, and that shows the shelving that we have for Braille. We have, I would estimate about twice as much space of archival shelving for large print materials. And these materials are physical materials. Our large print is a photocopy of the print book as large as we can get it on either 11 by 14 or 11 by 17 paper. And that's our physical materials. So some things to remember about our formats. When AERO's production standards improve, we do not automatically redo all previous titles. So if you find something that should work and isn't working, please get in touch with us. We will redo them and update them to our latest standard. Advisors can always talk to us if the material we are providing doesn't meet the needs of the student. We are serving students. That's why our service exists. So we will do what we can to improve our files. AERO creates alternate formats of materials that can be used again, not materials created by school board staff. So we won't create tests and we will not create teacher-created materials. But novels, textbooks are materials that we will create. And if you are having difficulty determining the best alternate format for the student, please ask the experts at your school board or accessibility services office. At AERO, we know what our formats can do, but we don't know your student, and so we don't know what's best for them. So if you have any questions after this presentation, or you want to register with us, please get in touch. So for questions, we'll get to that next, but if you're watching the recording, you can email us your questions. If you're an educator watching this and you say, oh, I fit the criteria and I have students that need your services, please go to alternativeresources.ca and register yourself for our services. You can get started right away, and if we already have the materials in our catalog, you can have them by the end of the day. So it is time for questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Isabel. That was terrific summary of, I think, of the services you offer. So let's, thanks again. And I'm just looking to see if we have any questions coming in.
We don't.
That's interesting.
But we're happy to receive.
I'm sure. Yes, I'm sure. I have a question then.
Yes.
If you do not have a specific resource, how long does it take usually to prepare it? For instance, a new novel into a PDF.
So novels are a lot faster than textbooks for preparing, but our standard, what we say as a standard is we will not guarantee anything for 2 weeks from the time we have both a timeline for when the student needs that material and an original to produce from. So sometimes we'll have a file that we can use to produce the final format already, but we still need a timeline. And the reason that we have this policy and the reason that we ask for that is because we are juggling production for all students requiring alternate formats in Ontario, both elementary, secondary, and post-secondary. And to do that juggling well, we need to know when students need it, because we want to provide each student with what they're using now in the classroom and not what they were using 2 weeks ago in the classroom. And to do that juggling well, if you're placing a request in June and it's not needed until November, that's helpful because we'll start the production in October so that you have it for November. But we won't be trying to produce it in September when many students need materials right away.
Mm-hmm. And do audiobooks take longer to produce? Or do you generally get those? Do you create the audiobooks or you're getting them from your partners?
So we will create the synthetic audio ourselves. Yeah. We also work with contracted vendors to produce the formats that we don't produce ourselves as transcriptionists.
Great. I see a lot of questions here. We can.
Yeah. And the answer to does audio take longer is the other reason we have that we don't guarantee anything for 2 weeks is that because 99% of the time in 2 weeks we can get you something. So we might not get you the entire text, but we will get the student something they can start with, and then we try and regularly produce after that so that we're keeping up with the student.
Wow. Yeah, that's terrific.
Yes.
Great.
So one question, just to confirm, the school would need a license or a physical copy of a text for AERO to transfer it to another file?
Yes. So the way we handle this is when an advisor places a request on the system, we ask them to check off that there is a purchased copy of the material for the student. This can be a copy from, for instance, for silent reading material or a book report, if the student's taking a book out from the school library. If the student signs that out from the school library and that book goes on the shelf and isn't used by another student, that's considered a print copy that is available for use by the student, but it's in a format they can't use. So that counts as the print copy for the student.
Okay. So here's another question. If you receive a textbook and there are pictures, diagrams, etc. in the textbook, will you provide accessible text and pictures in a PDF format? Typically, pictures and diagrams will be important if it is a textbook.
Right. So I am going to go back up a bit. So in a PDF, what the student gets is an image. So one page in the PDF image will correspond to one page in the print text. In this example, there isn't any text on top of the image here, but if there was, we would have zoned that text and recognized that text so that it was read and given that text a reading order so that the page would read correctly. And if the student needed to go back and say, select the text on the image, select the text in the different parts of the graph, they would be able to do that and listen to the text that was there. But what we don't provide is a description of the image for a user who doesn't have vision. For users who aren't able to see graphs and diagrams in a PDF, we recommend, but that information is still important, we recommend that they request a Word format which will have those diagrams described.
Interesting.
Very interesting. So we have a question here. How is PDF different from Kurzweil?
So today they're actually very similar in how they can be used depending on the text-to-speech software that you have. PDF, the main difference is that Kurzweil is a proprietary format, and to open a Kurzweil file, you must have a Kurzweil license. But in terms of, they're both visual images of the page where we have done text recognition and verified the underlying text. Kurzweil as a program has more built-in literacy tools and test-taking tools, whereas PDF doesn't have those tools built into the program. But PDF is a format that anyone can download a PDF reader to open a PDF file.
Good, thank you. Here's a question about French immersion. How do you deal with French immersion requests?
AERO is a bilingual service, and there are Anglophone and Francophone schools in the province. We probably have quite a few French immersion resources already, in part because they're being used in Francophone schools in the province, especially when it comes to math texts. Those are often the same texts that are used in a French immersion classroom as they are in a Francophone school. And AERO as a whole, because Ontario as a whole, there are some different languages being taught. I know we have materials in Spanish. I know we have done a beginner's Italian book, and I know we've done a university level learning Arabic book. A student was taking the course, so we created the materials because the student needed those materials.
Wonderful. Okay, and do you, well, you've answered this already, but maybe clarification is required. Do you produce human narrated audio or DAISY?
Yes, so we will produce human narrated audio. When we get it from our partners, it's sometimes just in MP3 audio format. But if we're producing it ourselves, we will always produce it as a DAISY format. If your student prefers human narration to synthetic voice narration, when you're requesting new material, please put that in the comments. Because it's not our default to do human voice narration. Our default is to do this synthetic voice.
Right. Along the same lines, do you have an example to show us how audio is different from Daisy?
Oh, no. I am not prepared to do that demonstration. I'm trying
to describe it. Just
a lot of it is the navigation. So an audio file, almost any audio you get from AERO will be multiple MP3 files. So the actual audio part will be in an MP3 file. And if it's just CD audio, then those MP3 files are named so that if they're played in a player that's in order, it will read the book in order. Those files might be broken up by chapter, and if you want to navigate to a specific point, if you want to say you listened to the first book for an hour and then you want to go back and listen to more, you'll have to remember what file you were in, which audio file, and open that audio file to start in the right spot. Daisy audio, when used in a Daisy player, will open an interface that looks a lot like a web page with hyperlinks. The hyperlinks will be the different sections of the book. Exactly how small those sections get depend on how the Daisy was created. Mm-hmm. It usually goes at least to chapter, and so you'll open up the Daisy, get this web page looking interface with hyperlinks, and if you listen for an hour and you finish chapter 2 and you know you're on chapter 3, you just click on chapter 3 and it takes you right there. You don't have to remember what file it was.
Mm-hmm.
That's
so you have a Daisy reader software on the device you're using?
Yes.
Yes, and for the audio, again, you have some sort of app or software to listen to it, or can you, to listen to the audio, CD audio?
Yeah, so anything, we call it CD audio because it's audio files that when we deliver them physically just arrive on a CD, but they are MP3 files.
Okay.
And anything that plays in MP3 file, so often the default music player that comes with an operating system will play the CD audio format.
Right, okay.
On a related note, I know if you search, there are now free Daisy players for desktop as well as for mobile devices.
Yeah.
I can't remember the names of the.
Is one Easy Reader? There's Easy Reader. I think the CELA materials are provided through Easy Reader.
Yeah, Easy Reader is the one for mobile devices that just came out.
Yeah, I have that on my phone. Yeah. Great.
2 more questions. Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned this before, but it's okay to clarify. How long is the loaning period?
So when educators place a request, we ask them for the date the material is required, which will become the start of the loaning period, and the date the course finishes. So often people, when they put in a request, if it's for a textbook that's being used all year, we'll put in tomorrow's date because we don't accept time travel, and the course end date will be the 30th of June. We don't allow advisors to request materials 12 months in advance, but we do allow advisors to place requests 6 months in advance. Yeah, so the loan period is a school year, and it's also possible to renew materials instead of requesting them again for another school year.
Okay. One last question. We have a school board that creates surveys for students. Apparently, this would be lengthy, and they want to know if you would prepare a version of the survey that would be accessible to students.
The answer is most likely no. If you want a more researched answer, then I recommend emailing us. But AERO's general policy when it comes to school board created materials is that it was created at the school board and should be created accessible. The best way to get accessible content is if the person creating it makes it accessible from the get-go. So when there's things we're asked to do that are created by school boards, we'll often say, well, why is it so difficult to make it accessible in the first place?
Right.
Right.
And we have a lovely comment for you, Isabel. So thankful that you hosted this session. I had no idea that a service like AERO existed. This can help so many of my primary students. Thank you for enlightening me.
Great. And I had the same response when I learned about your services, and that's why we were keen to have you here tonight so that we can help make more people. I think that there's an under awareness of this service, and I think I'm hoping this will, well, it may keep you too busy, but hopefully we're going to make some more people aware of it, because I think it's a fantastic service. So thank you, Isabel, for all your time and a great, very clear presentation about AERO.
You're welcome.